Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. Welcome back to the place where the lights stay low, where the air feels just a little heavier than it should, and where the stories we share are not the kind you forget when morning comes. Tonight, we are stepping back across the threshold and returning to where we love to go, deep inside the haunted houses, the ones that hold their secrets in the walls, in the floors, in the very air that settles around you when the rest of the world has gone quiet. Pull your blanket a little closer, settle into your favorite chair. Make sure your door is shut tight and your lamp is burning bright, because what I am about to share with you tonight is a truly chilling collection of stories, each one as real and as raw as the people who lived them. These are not fairy tales. These are not invented frights designed to make you jump and then laugh it off. No. These are the experiences of real men and women, real children, real families, who found themselves face to face with something they could not explain, something that refused to play by the ordinary rules of the world we think we know. And if you have your own story, if something has happened to you in the dark hours of the night or in the quiet corners of a house that never quite felt right, I hope you will stay with me all the way to the end. Because tonight, every voice matters. Tonight, every shadow has a story. And it all begins right now. If you are new here and you have somehow stumbled into this little corner of the night for the very first time, please do consider subscribing to the channel and joining our wonderful community. We would truly love to have you with us. You will not want to miss a single story, I promise you that. Now, let us begin. Let the darkness take control. This first story belongs to a mother, and it is being told through the voice of her child, the child who carried this memory for years before finding the courage to finally speak it aloud. I was around 13 years old when this happened to me. It was late one evening, the kind of night where the house feels too quiet and the hallway stretches just a little longer than it should. I was walking down that narrow corridor of our old home when something caught my attention from the corner of my eye movement. There was a figure coming toward me through the passage ahead, moving with purpose, striding in my direction. My first instinct, reasonable enough for that hour of the night, was that it must be my brother. He was the only other soul who had any business wandering the house at such a late hour. But something felt wrong immediately. Not wrong in a way I could name or point to, but wrong in the way your stomach knows before your mind catches up. A subtle, deeply unsettling distortion in the way this figure moved that sent a wave of instinctive dread washing right through me. So I turned fully, squaring myself to face whatever was approaching, and I got the clearest, most unforgettable look of my young life at what was coming toward me through that dim hallway. What I saw was a man. He stood approximately 5 feet tall. He wore a bright red shirt, neatly tucked into a perfectly ordinary pair of blue jeans. His form was solid, detailed, completely convincing from the top of his head right down to his upper thighs, and then everything changed. Below that point, his body simply faded. It dissolved the way morning mist disappears in the warmth of the rising sun. His lower body became transparent, then translucent, then gone entirely, legs, feet, all of it blurring into absolute nothingness right before my eyes, while his upper half remained clear and visible and horribly, impossibly real. For one frozen heartbeat, I stared, and then he vanished. Completely, silently. Without a single sound or disturbance, he was simply gone, leaving nothing but the empty hallway stretching behind me, bare and utterly still, with not a trace of evidence that anything unusual had just occurred. As you can imagine, fear crashed over me like a cold wave because I had never seen this man before in my life. Nobody in our family resembled him. Nobody dressed like him. Nobody matched that description in any way. And so I did what many of us do when we see something our minds cannot make sense of. I said nothing. I kept it entirely to myself for years. I was too frightened to mention it, even to my own mother, because saying it out loud felt like opening a door that could never be properly closed again. Putting words to what I had seen felt like an invitation, like whatever that figure was might hear its name being spoken and decide to come back. It was not until much later, when our family was packing everything up for a move across the country, and I found myself seated beside my mother on a long, turbulent flight, that I finally gathered the courage to tell her everything, every single detail. She listened carefully at first, her face growing noticeably pale as I described the red-shirted figure, the way his lower body simply ceased to exist, the way he vanished without a sound. And when I finished, she told me something that chilled me far more deeply than the original encounter ever had. My brother had seen the exact same man, repeatedly. Starting around the same time that I had, only his experiences had been far more aggressive and far more persistent. That figure had turned our home into a place of constant, low-level dread, especially for my brother. The man would linger silently in the corner of my brother's bedroom at all hours of the day and night, watching without moving, watching without speaking, a presence that wore the house down the way water wears down stone. The lights would flicker on and off by themselves whenever the figure appeared nearby, switches clicking audibly without a single hand to touch them, while shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls from no visible source at all. But there came one particular night that stood out from all the rest as the very worst of it. My brother was walking casually into his room, his mind drifting through ordinary teenage thoughts, when an invisible force slammed into him with enough power to drive his shoulder hard into the wall, leaving a bruise that told its own grim story. He stumbled backward, gasping, eyes scanning the empty room around him, searching desperately for whoever or whatever had struck him. But the room was completely empty. No explanation. No one there. Just a cold spot lingering in the air where something had made contact with him, something that had, in that terrible moment, proven it was not merely watching anymore. That shove marked the first truly physical encounter my brother endured, a dark turning point that shifted what had started as unsettling visitations into something capable of reaching across the invisible line between its world and ours, and leaving tangible marks to prove it had done so. Both of us had crossed paths with the same apparition, completely independently, and neither of us had known. We never learned who or what that figure truly was. Perhaps some soul still bound to the property, tethered there by something we could not see or understand. Perhaps a warning. Perhaps something drawn to the particular vulnerability of youth. That answer I will leave entirely with you. If something like this has ever happened to you, something you saw or felt in your own home that you could never quite explain, please do write it in the comments below. You are absolutely not alone, and I truly love reading every single one of your experiences. This happened about 2 years ago, and the memory of it still has not fully let the person who lived it go free. Her great-grandmother lives in a house that has been standing for approximately 130 years. It sits roughly 15 minutes outside the city, and as a child, she hated that house with everything she had. Her parents would drop her off there for the entire summer, year after year, even though she begged them not to. She loved her grandmother deeply with all her heart, but she could not sleep in that house. It was not a childish nervousness or an overactive imagination. It was something she felt physically, a strange, oppressive bad energy that seemed to seep out of the walls and settle over her, refusing to leave her in peace through the long, dark nights. As she grew older, she found a compromise. She would visit her grandmother, but only during daylight hours, always making sure to be gone before night properly fell. Then her great-grandfather passed away, and everything changed. She could not bring herself to leave the old woman alone through the night, and her grandmother refused absolutely to sleep anywhere but her own home. So there was no choice. She would stay. She brought her boyfriend along for company and courage, thinking that having someone beside her would make the darkness easier to bear. The two of them settled onto the couch in the living room, heads pointing toward the door, and tried to make the best of it. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning when it began. She could not sleep and had been quietly scrolling through her phone while her boyfriend rested soundly beside her. She finally talked herself into putting the phone away and trying to actually rest. For approximately 5 minutes, everything was completely still and perfectly fine. And then she heard it, the old wooden floors beginning to creak, that familiar sound of weight being placed deliberately on aged timber. She lay completely still, eyes closed, assuming it must be her grandmother. The living room door opened. The old cabinet doors groaned on their hinges the way they always did when someone searched through them. Since that particular cabinet held medication, and since her grandmother had a heart condition, concern flickered through her immediately. She called out softly without opening her eyes, asking whether everything was all right. No reply came. The sounds continued near the door, the rustling of someone searching, the quiet movement of someone looking for the right thing in the darkness. She called out again, a little more clearly this time, asking if her grandmother needed something, asking if all was well. Still nothing, no voice, no response of any kind, so she sat up. She turned her head toward the door. And she screamed. What stood in that doorway was not her grandmother. It was a dark, hunched silhouette, the shape of something old, something female in a vague and deeply wrong way, and it had no face. It simply stood there in the shadows, still, faceless, pointed directly at her. The moment her scream tore through the silence, her boyfriend lurched upright and slapped the light switch, and the figure was gone. Her grandmother came rushing in moments later, woken by the sound that, she later said, had woken what felt like the entire village. Neither of them believed her. They told her she had probably been dreaming, probably been in that hazy space between sleep and waking where the mind manufactures horrors. But she swears on her life she was fully awake. She knows what she saw. She did some research afterward. She discovered that the very first owner of that old house, a house built well over a century ago, had been an elderly woman who died alone in the hallway in 1922. A heart attack, right there in the corridor. For the next 4 months after that night, she could not sleep with the lights off. The memory still frightens her today, living in her bones the way some things simply refuse to leave. Now we travel to a very particular place, one whose history goes far deeper than most people realize, and to a family whose connection to that place runs through generations of inexplicable experience. Cave in Rock, Illinois. For those unfamiliar with the name, it is not merely the name of a small town. It is also the name of a remarkable and deeply unsettling geographic feature. A cave carved into the bluffs alongside the Ohio River, where, in the rough and lawless days of the American frontier, pirates would disguise themselves as women to lure riverboats close, then murder the pilots and passengers and make off with everything of value. That same town carries strong ties to the Harp brothers, among the very first documented serial killers in American history. The land there is old in a way that is difficult to describe, old with violence and old with memory. This particular storyteller grew up in that town between the ages of 1 and 8, frequently staying with an aunt and uncle who lived on a hill near the ferry landing, not far from the banks of the Ohio River and the cave itself. And almost every single family member who spent time in that house has a distinct, unforgettable memory of something they cannot explain. The aunt and uncle experienced it themselves on multiple occasions. More than once, the pull chain on their ceiling fan, the one that hung directly above the center of their bed, would tug itself downward audibly, and the light would turn on, all on its own, while they were in the living room watching television. And it happened again one night when they were already in bed. The fan was positioned in such a way that you would have to stand directly in the middle of the mattress to reach that chain. There was simply no logical explanation. They would return home from shopping trips and find every door and every window standing wide open, including the cabinet doors, as though someone had moved deliberately and unhurriedly through the entire house, opening everything in their path. The storyteller's own experiences began one evening in the late 90s or early 2000s when they were staying with their uncle. The uncle had a large, impressive stereo system with floor-standing tower speakers, and the remote control had gone missing. While they were both searching for it, the recliner chair in the room fully extended itself, slowly, smoothly, as though a person had just leaned back in it, and the stereo powered on, volume climbing all the way up to full blast, entirely on its own. There was another night, staying with cousins and sharing a bed the way children do, when they were all woken in the deep dark of the night by the family's Dalmatian, barking, frantic, absolutely beside itself. The dog was fixated on the rocking chair sitting in the corner of the bedroom, and when the children looked, the chair was moving, rocking steadily, deliberately back and forth with no one sitting in it and no breeze to explain it. The cousin doing what older children sometimes do to protect the younger ones from fear, calmly said it was nothing to worry about and told them to go back to sleep. But the image stayed. The final experience, however, the one that has never faded, the one that still sits in the memory like something pressed permanently into soft wax, happened during a visit with a parent. The aunt and uncle stepped out of the living room briefly to show the mother something, leaving the storyteller alone for just a few minutes. A bad feeling descended immediately, the kind that has no source you can point to but fills you completely. They took only a step or two before something wrapped around them. The sound of the room dropped away. Their voice left them. Their ability to move vanished. No matter how desperately they tried to cry out, nothing came. They have no idea to this day how long it lasted. Only that when the mother returned and asked if they were all right, the only thing the child could do was cry. Now 31 years old, this person still carries those unanswered questions. The aunt and uncle moved out of the house when they were around 8, meaning it has been at least 23 years since anyone in the family has lived there. But during a recent trip home for a funeral, something happened that cracked everything open again. A grandmother, the most deeply religious, no-nonsense woman the family had ever known, someone who had never once in her life mentioned anything remotely paranormal, came and sat down beside the aunt and uncle at the lunch table after the service. And she asked them directly, had anything unexplainable ever happened in that house? She was told everything, and her expression shifted in a way that could not be faked or misread. It turned out that the current owner of the house, 27 years later, was still experiencing phenomena serious enough that he had come to this grandmother, to her church, asking if she knew anything, asking if she could help. Part of the storyteller wants to go back to speak with that owner, to step inside those rooms one more time and face whatever is still there. But there is another voice, louder, wiser perhaps, that says some things are in the past for a reason, and that the past is precisely where they should stay. This next story is told by a child about what happened to their mother, a woman who was between 5 and 7 years old when it began. When the mother was a small girl, the family moved into a new house situated right next door to where her parents eventually settled permanently. The woman who sold them the house had seemed a little strange from the moment they met her, but families are often generous with their assumptions about strangers, and no one thought much of it at the time. Within a few months of moving in, the mother began experiencing things in her bedroom. Footsteps that arrived when no one was walking. Sounds of objects falling when nothing had actually moved. Her parents, hearing the noises at night and assuming it was their daughter causing a disturbance, would discipline her, grounding her for the disruptions she was not responsible for. Being a small child, she could not make them understand. They assumed, as parents sometimes do, that she was simply making things up. But then one day, the grandfather heard the noises himself. He went upstairs. He opened the bedroom door, and what he saw stopped him cold. The string on the ceiling fan was curled, wound, and twisted in a way that no natural draft could account for. The rocking chair in the corner was moving at an extreme, violent speed, rocking so hard and fast it looked as though invisible hands were shaking it back and forth without pause. And pressed against the wall, as far from everything as the room would allow, was his small daughter, terrified, utterly rigid with fear. Then, as though someone had snapped their fingers, everything stopped simultaneously, perfectly still, like it had never happened. He got the child out of that room immediately. He went to his own bedroom closet, and he prayed with everything he had, asking whatever God might be listening to remove whatever had entered that house, and to leave his family in peace. The next day, while the children were at school, the parents went back to that room with a purpose. They pulled up the carpet, and beneath it, etched into the floor, they found what could only be described as a summoning circle. Written, it appeared, in dried old blood and salt. Research and questioning eventually led them to a deeply unsettling truth. The woman who had sold them the house had practiced witchcraft and had performed rituals in that very room. They brought in a priest. He prayed over that house again and again, returning until finally, the presence lifted, and the room fell quiet for good. This story comes from Toronto, a family who had just moved into a new home, children sent to stay with grandparents while the parents worked on getting the place properly cleaned and set up. Nothing dramatically wrong at first, only an odd, heavy sense of dread that seemed to exist specifically in the kitchen, hanging there like something that had seeped into the very tiles and refused to leave. She ignored it. She had a house to unpack. Her husband had been given a blue jumpsuit as a gag gift at some point, something silly that had never actually been worn. While sorting through clothing, she tossed it onto the back shelf of the closet. It came back down. She tossed it again. It came back down again. She rolled it tightly into a ball and pushed it as far back as it would go, then walked down the hallway to tell her husband, laughing about it, that the house seemed to be rejecting their belongings. She turned around and walked back into the bedroom. Every hair on her body stood straight up. A sick, lurching feeling rolled through her stomach. The jumpsuit was lying flat on the bed, fully unrolled, completely spread out, positioned with a deliberateness that no tumbling, rolling piece of fabric could have managed on its own. It was approximately 8 feet from the closet. There was no draft. There was no explanation. Her husband offered one anyway. Perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps she had left it there and forgotten. Perhaps it had fallen and somehow unrolled itself to lie perfectly flat in that exact position. She accepted this. She went to work on the bathroom, recaulking the poorly done bathtub, keeping herself busy. Afterwards, she joined her husband in the living room and sat down. The cushion beneath her shifted distinctly, unmistakably, like something adjusting underneath it. She reacted. He calmed her. Suggested perhaps the cleaning fumes combined with exhaustion might be affecting her perception. She tried again. This time, something grabbed her. Not a subtle movement, not an impression, a deliberate, forceful poke, hard enough to push her upward from the cushion. She cried out. They began seriously considering whether some animal had gotten into the house through the moving process, went out and purchased traps just in case. 2 days later, the children moved in. Their 5-year-old son began to struggle with sleep immediately, telling his parents that every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was fire, endless flames, and a man standing inside them. Then the parents themselves began to experience it. In that in-between stage, not quite asleep, not quite awake, the soft and vulnerable territory of the half-dreaming mind, imagery began to arrive. Violent imagery, dark and disturbing scenes of death and suffering, the kind neither of them had ever encountered before in any dream or waking state. Both of them, separately, consistently. And then came the night that surpassed everything else. She woke to the sound of her 2-year-old daughter crying, not a fussy, tired cry, but a cry of genuine pain or terrible fright. She ran. Over the crib, positioned between the child and the glow of the nightlight, a dark shadow hung in the air, solid, unmoving. It was near the mobile of paper birds that usually spun gently above the crib. She reached in and lifted her daughter out. She noticed the mobile was completely still, not a single paper bird moving. She blew a breath directly at it. Nothing. The mobile did not stir. The shadow did not move. It was simply there, dense and dark and cold. She was terrified, but she was also a mother, and the anger that burns in a mother when something threatens her child is a powerful thing. She spoke to it firmly and clearly. She told it that was enough, and she took her daughter to her own bed. She retrieved her son from his room as well. She did not sleep again that night. When they eventually adopted a rescue cat, the intensity of the activity in the house seemed to settle somewhat. But the heavy, oppressive feeling in the kitchen never fully lifted. They moved when the lease ended and have not experienced anything remotely like it in any home before or since. Like this video and share it with someone you care about if these stories are getting under your skin. And if you have your own experience from a house that never felt quite right, please share it in the comments. We are all listening. This next story takes us to small-town Illinois, population hovering around 2,500 at the time of the events, and sitting at roughly 1,000 today. A town founded in 1850, transformed by the arrival of the railway in the 1880s, and home to a building with a history as layered and dark as any you are likely to encounter. The house predated the official settlement of the town itself. It began as a farmhouse, then, as the railroad brought growth and commerce, and crowds of people through, it became a hotel. It was a substantial structure, 2 full stories, 12 bedrooms, and a massive basement complete with its own freshwater well. It was owned by the Miller family, a wealthy and well-respected farming family who rose to even greater prominence after the railroad boom. Later in the 1800s, it cycled through phases: farmhouse again, then rumored to operate as a brothel, then converted into a funeral home where the embalming was performed and the bodies were displayed for services while the family continued to live within those same walls. The Millers held on to it until roughly the turn of the 20th century, when tuberculosis swept through and claimed most of them. 2 members of the family stand out in the history of that house. James Miller, a violent, alcoholic man with deeply ugly views on the world, whose exact relationship to the family structure remains somewhat unclear. And Sarah Miller, 12 years old, the youngest daughter. It appears, based on things found in the house later, that Sarah died before James did, sometime around 1901. After the tuberculosis outbreak, records go essentially dark until 1910, when the remaining family sold the property to the city. It became a hotel for railroad workers, passed through the hands of various families, and then when the railroad industry died in the 1950s, it was left standing and empty for approximately 60 years. Eventually, the city sold it, and a new family purchased it with plans to transform it into a small commercial haunted house attraction. When that renovation process began, when the new owners started gutting the interior to give it a fresh foundation, they began finding things inside the walls, inside the attic, tucked into the ceiling, letters, notes, personal items that had been hidden away or simply forgotten by the people who once lived and died there. And shortly after those discoveries began, so did the activity. Small things first. Tools moved between one session and the next. The sound of footsteps in rooms where no one was walking. Objects that seemed to drop from nowhere. The owners, being what the storyteller describes as genuine enthusiasts of the paranormal, found this thrilling rather than frightening. For a time, things remained at that manageable, almost exciting level. Then the storyteller came to work for them, and the summer they would later call the spooky summer began. It started with a severe spring thunderstorm that drove everyone inside to take a break from the renovation work. They were gathered together, talking, when a loud crash came from the back of the house. When they went to investigate, the owner's ladder and tools had been scattered and thrown across the room, and the temperature in that space had dropped to something icily, unmistakably cold. While they stood there trying to process what they were seeing, one of the other workers suggested they go upstairs. They did. The room they had just finished decorating had been destroyed. Curtains ripped from their rods, decorative items thrown into other rooms, a wheelchair overturned. They left early that day. Things were relatively calm for about a year after that. The haunted house season went smoothly. Then the following summer arrived and brought everything with it. The owner of the house was an imposing man, large, physically powerful, a former professional wrestler who had to turn sideways to fit through certain doorways. The storyteller arrived one morning to find him standing on the porch with a 1,000-yard stare and a sizable bruise already forming on his forehead. He had opened the basement door, been hit by a wave of icy air, heard a loud exhaling sound, and then felt something strike him in the head with the force of a large fist. The blow knocked him backward onto the ground. His instinct from years of physical training was to get up and fight, but there was no one there. He got up, locked the door behind him, and came outside. Later that same day, while they were working in the basement, another worker decided to explore a hole that led to the space beneath another section of the house. He came back carrying large glass jugs filled with some kind of liquid. While the group was examining them and discussing what they might be, a crash came from upstairs. The rocking chair that had been sitting at the top of the second-floor staircase was now at the bottom of it. A few weeks after that, as they were finishing up for the day and putting tools away, the storyteller felt a sudden burning pain across their back, sharp, intense, the kind of sensation you would associate with something breaking the skin. When they removed their shirt to check, deep scratches ran down their back, not enough to bleed but clearly marked, clearly real, still visible hours later. They left. When they pulled it shut behind them, they could hear things being thrown and dragged around inside the house. The following day, the interior was in chaos again. That summer, they began attempting to communicate more directly, leaving tape recorders, a book with crayons, video cameras. What they captured were voices, a man's voice, louder, and a little girl's voice, quieter but somehow saying more. Whenever the man's voice appeared on recordings, the physical activity in the house would escalate, stomping sounds, things being dropped with force. The book left with crayons was found scribbled in. It all reached its peak in October. The haunted house was running its season. One of the workers had made a habit of taunting the presence in the house, talking down to it, insulting it, invoking his heritage as though that gave him immunity. On closing night, while the storyteller stood outside with other workers, 3 unknown men came running out of the front door, visibly panicked. The taunter followed. He had been struck in the chest with enough force to knock him to the ground. A bruise the size of a fist was already forming. He was furious in a way that went beyond performance, genuinely, deeply angry, the kind of anger that comes from humiliation and shock and real pain. The owner of the house, who was an outspoken atheist, a loud and proud one, stood outside that building and declared that he would contact every single religious organization he could locate to come and remove whatever was inside. He said that if nothing worked, he would tear the building down himself, which he eventually did about 8 years later for what were described as safety and financial reasons. After that October, the intensity faded. There were still strange moments, still things that made the skin crawl, but nothing matching the ferocity of that summer. The storyteller went to college the following year and lost contact with the household. What became of things after they left, they do not know. What would you do if you found yourself working in a place like that? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. This next story is about a childhood best friend's house, and the night that permanently changed the storyteller's relationship with the idea that some places are simply alive with something else. Rachel's house sat in what was known as the most haunted area of their small town, ground connected to an old native. American burial place. Rachel herself was always candid about the strangeness of her home, the unexplained sounds, the feelings, the things that happened without reason. From the outside looking in, however, the house was wonderful. The neighborhood was one of the nicest in town, older, well-maintained, deeply respected. And Rachel's mother was the kind of woman who made a home feel like a celebration at all times. She decorated for every holiday, baked the most extraordinary homemade apple pies, and threw parties that children talked about for weeks afterward. The storyteller spent a great deal of time in that house over the years, at school project sessions and slumber parties and ordinary afternoon visits. It was beloved to them, and yet. The night the story centers on was one of Rachel's slumber parties. Rachel's father was out of town. The day had been full and fun, and eventually the girls had settled into Rachel's bedroom, floor covered so completely with air mattresses that not an inch of carpet was visible. The storyteller was positioned on a mattress near the open door. Rachel's door was always kept open at night. At the top of the stairs, the family kept an industrial fan running through the night specifically to mask the sounds the house made on its own. They had learned, apparently, that it was better to give their children and guests something familiar and steady to listen to than to let the house's own voice be heard in the silence. The storyteller could not sleep. The fan noise, though understandable in purpose, made it harder rather than easier for them to drift off. They lay awake in the dim room while the other girls slept peacefully around them, watching the shadows and listening. At some point during those wakeful hours, they heard Rachel's mother's bedroom door open and heard her walk out and descend the stairs. They knew it was her because her bedroom door faced Rachel's at the top of the staircase, with the fan positioned between them in the hallway. Her husband was away. Every other girl in the room was asleep. It had to be her. Downstairs, sounds began, the sounds of someone in the kitchen, moving around, preparing something. And the storyteller, lying awake in the dark with nothing to do but wait and listen, became increasingly certain that Rachel's mother was making breakfast. The image of those legendary chocolate chip pancakes, with powdered sugar available for dusting if you wanted it, took complete hold of their imagination. Wide awake now with anticipation, they waited for the smell, for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, for the warm invitation to come and eat. Time passed. Morning light began to seep through the blinds, pale and gentle, casting a soft glow across the bottom of the staircase. The storyteller had shifted position so they had a clear view of those stairs. And then Rachel's mother walked out of her bedroom and down the stairs. The storyteller's heart stopped, because Rachel's mother had not come back up the stairs, not once. From the moment they had originally heard her walk down step by step, the two famously squeaky stairs announcing her descent the way they always did, she had not come back up. There had been only the sound of someone working in the kitchen, and then this, the sight of the woman emerging from her bedroom for the first time and going downstairs again. Going downstairs for the first time. The smell reached them then, rising up through the house. Pancakes and bacon. But the storyteller realized with a terrible clarity that they had not smelled any food cooking during the earlier commotion in the kitchen. The commotion, they had been so certain, was Rachel's mother preparing breakfast. They sat frozen with the cold, deafening weight of what they now understood they had experienced. Rachel's mother came upstairs eventually and woke everyone cheerfully for breakfast. Nothing more happened that particular morning. But after that night, the supernatural experiences in that house began to find the storyteller with increasing regularity. Whatever had been there had introduced itself, and now it knew they could hear it. This story comes from a family's 4-year stay in a rental house, an experience that touched every single person living within its walls, though it chose some of them more heavily than others. The narrator was 4 years old when it began. The family's own home was being rebuilt, and in the interim they rented a place connected by an unusual room to the home of an aunt and uncle. The household consisted of the 4-year-old girl, her 27-year-old mother, her 35-year-old father, her 43-year-old uncle, his 42-year-old wife, and a 6-year-old female cousin. 7 people, 2 connected homes, and a house that felt completely wrong despite sitting in the middle of an ordinary city neighborhood. The property was distinctive. A large door opened onto a gravel-covered hill that sloped downward, and at the bottom stood 2 old houses side by side, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over woods. It felt displaced somehow, out of time, out of place, as though it belonged to some other version of the city entirely. From the very first night, things began. Footsteps on the roof. Neighbors calling the police after seeing a figure they believed to be a prowler, only to watch that figure dissolve into the edge of the woods as the officers arrived. In 4 years, every member of the household experienced something, some incident subtle, some deeply disturbing. The uncle saw a figure. Months later, the cousin saw the exact same figure, and crucially, the uncle had never described his experience to her. There had been no possibility of suggestion or imitation. The father, alone in the house one night, felt with complete physical certainty that someone was lying beside him in the bed, curled up close as a sleeping person would be. There was, of course, no one there. But the mother had it worst of all, and what she went through grew progressively darker over time. It began with visions, flashes of something that had not yet happened, and then those things would come to pass, exactly as she had seen them, approximately 1 hour later. She began to fear for her sanity. Then, whenever she was home alone, framed photographs would fall from the walls with no explanation. Then, whenever she left the house for more than a few hours, the father would suffer. Thrown violently from a window ledge in the basement while exercising outside in the yard, he has always insisted he was pushed. Scratches appearing on his body without cause, his legs, his back, his face. And then came the incident with the baby brother. 2 years into their stay, the mother gave birth to a son. When the boy was approximately 6 months old, she was lying beside him on the bed when she suddenly realized he was not there. Frantic, she checked his crib, empty. She searched the entire room, nothing. She ran to the neighboring house where the uncle and aunt lived, hoping someone had taken the baby to give her a rest. No one was home. She ran back, grabbed the phone, called her husband, and found her son peacefully asleep on the bed, in exactly the spot where she had thought he was all along. There was another incident when the narrator was approximately 7 and the baby brother was 1 year old. The mother, the narrator, an older cousin who visited occasionally, and the baby brother were all sitting together in that strange bedroom waiting for the father to arrive for a shopping trip. The baby was sitting quietly on the floor in front of the mother's dresser, which had a large mirror mounted on top. Without warning, without any physical trigger, the mirror shattered. It did not fall. It simply exploded outward, sending shards of glass raining down onto the child on the floor below it. Eventually, the mother reached her limit and went to see a psychic. She was told that the house contained multiple presences and that one of them had developed an attachment to her specifically. A fixation. According to the psychic, this explained why the father was being targeted whenever the mother left the house. The psychic worked to address it, and for a time, things did improve. The visions stopped. The father's injuries ceased, but the house never became a light place. It always carried that sense of something watching from just beyond the edge of what you could see. The narrator is 26 now and has returned to that neighborhood. She visits the house sometimes. The gravel hill has been paved over with asphalt. The woods are gone, replaced by rows of apartment buildings. The house stands but looks swallowed by the modern world pressed in around it on all sides, and yet she still dreams of it at least once a week. The memories grip her the way certain things do when they have genuinely marked you. There is a pull she cannot name or silence, as though something in those walls is still, quietly waiting. This next story comes from someone who is 21 years old, still living in the family home while finishing college, a house that her father and grandfather built together from the ground up, with no previous owners and no history attached to it. Or so she had always believed. She found out only a few days before writing this that her aunt, her father's sister, who died from an overdose before the narrator was born, did not die far away somewhere in some unknown or distant place. She died in their living room, on the grandfather's old couch. The same couch that sat for years beneath the big window in that room. The same spot the narrator had always found faintly, inexplicably strange, but had dismissed because she had told herself for years that no one had ever died in this house. She had used that fact as a kind of mental shield, a line she returned to whenever something unsettled her. It turns out she had been wrong about it every single time. As a young child, most of her strange experiences came in the form of dreams, or things that felt like dreams but were too specific and too detailed to fully qualify as one. She remembers one vividly. A knight in full shining armor, every detail rendered with impossible clarity, standing in her bedroom doorway and simply watching her. As a child, she had an irrational but powerful fear of knights specifically, and seeing one that clearly in the liminal space between sleep and waking had been genuinely terrifying. The precision of the metal, the way light caught the surface of the armor, the deliberate, patient quality of the posture. She had learned to file experiences like that under the category of her brain doing strange things. She had gotten very good at filing. As she grew older, the experiences began to cross over from the territory of dreams into something that felt uncomfortably, undeniably present. Around the age of 16, she went through a period of consciously developing what she called her intuition meditation, paying close attention to gut feelings, noticing and sitting with the subtle impressions she received from spaces and situations. She did all of this work inside this house. At first it felt exciting, like opening a new room inside herself. But it did not stay that way. She began hearing things, not always words, sometimes just a pressure, a weighted sense of presence occupying the room alongside her when no one else was home. One night, alone in her bed and drifting towards sleep, she was snapped to full wakefulness by a whisper directly beside her head, clearly and deliberately saying her name. Not muffled through a wall, not some distant television bleed. Right next to her. She sat up with her heart hammering, checked every room, confirmed every door was locked. The house was completely empty. After enough experiences like that, she stopped trying to develop any ability she might have. She drew a deliberate line. She could manage feelings. She could manage sounds, but she did not want to see anything. When she was around 19, a dream came to her that crossed the line she had drawn. In it, she was lying face down on her own bed in her own room. Her boyfriend at the time stood beside the bed, watching over her as she slept. Then an arm extended from the narrow gap between her mattress and the side of the bed frame, reaching upward, wrapping around her arm and beginning to pull her down into that dark space. The fear was immediate and absolute. It woke her up. She snapped into full consciousness, lying face down in exactly that position, her arm hanging off the side of the bed, numb and prickling with that terrible pins and needles sensation that comes from a limb that has been starved of circulation. She looked down, expecting to find she had simply trapped the arm beneath herself. There was nothing, just the tingling and the strange sluggishness of her body as it came back to itself, as though some part of her was still in whatever she had just been pulled out of. And then she did the one thing she had always sworn she would not do. She turned her head to look at the space beside the bed where her boyfriend had been standing in the dream. A face looked back at her. Not a solid figure, more like a head and shoulders, transparent but detailed, kneeling beside the bed and leaning toward her. Close enough that they were eye to eye. It was smiling. The smile was wrong, not cruel, not angry, just deeply, inexplicably wrong for the situation. She had enough time to register every detail of it before it faded slowly, completely into nothingness. She was already awake. This was not a continuation of the dream. She got out of bed immediately and went straight to the living room where her father was sitting, and she told him everything. She could tell from his face that he believed her. He is intuitive himself, though he does not like to dwell on it or entertain the subject of the paranormal. But she saw the worry in his expression that night, and she knew it was real. More recently, she was home alone taking a bath. Her mother had just left to go to the grocery store. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside the bathroom, clear, normal, measured footsteps, the kind a person makes walking back and forth on a familiar floor. She called out through the closed door, assuming her mother had forgotten something, and returned. No answer. She called out louder because the continued silence felt almost rude. Still nothing, just the sound of someone continuing to pace back and forth in the hallway, steady and deliberate, and the slow rising of the hair on her arms. She picked up her phone and called her mother's number. Her mother's phone began to ring, from the kitchen. The footsteps stopped the instant the ringing started. She felt a momentary wave of relief. Her mother must have come back, must be in the kitchen, must just be reaching for the phone. But the phone kept ringing, and no one answered it, and no one called back, just the sound of a phone ringing in an empty kitchen in an empty house. She called her father the following day. He told her that he and her mother had gone to the store together. Her mother had accidentally left her phone at home. The house her father and grandfather built from scratch, with no history and no previous owners. The house where no one had ever died, except, as it turned out, they had. They had died right there in the living room, on the old couch beneath the big window, in a grief that no one had spoken about clearly enough for long enough to ever properly put to rest. And now the narrator does not know what exactly is in that house, whether it is her aunt. Whether it is something that arrived with her aunt or through her aunt. Whether it is something older and stranger than either of those explanations. She only knows that the place she grew up in does not feel the same as it once did. Perhaps, she says quietly, it never really did. And our final story for tonight. This person lives with their stepmother, father, younger sister, and brother in a house where strange things have been happening for some time. Unexplained noises. Shadows caught in the peripheral vision that vanish when you turn to look directly at them. The persistent feeling of being observed from somewhere you cannot identify. But everything they have just described is background compared to what happened the day they got home from work. There was only their little brother's truck in the driveway. They have a loud stereo in their shared bedroom that they play at high volume when the house is otherwise empty, something comforting about filling silent space with sound. Assuming their brother was home, they approached the house. They could hear the stereo clearly before they even reached the door. Loud music, though they could not quite make out what was playing. They touched the door handle. Silence, instant and total. The door to the bedroom was standing wide open. Heart rate climbing, they made their way slowly down the corridor and stood in the bedroom. Doorway looking in, empty. They laughed, the instinctive laughter of someone trying to convince themselves there is something funny about what is happening, and called out, telling their brother the joke was not landing and asking where he was hiding. No response. They stepped through the doorway into the room. The door slammed shut behind them with force. Something shoved them forward, pushing them hard enough that they stumbled and fell to the floor. They got up, they threw the door open. They searched every room in the house. There was not a single other person there. They called their brother and asked with barely controlled panic where exactly he was hiding. He replied, genuinely confused, that he was at church. He had ridden there with their mother. They joined him. They hate church. They went anyway. When they got there, their brother took one look at their face and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. When they told him what had happened, the color drained from his face completely, and he told them what had happened to him the night before. He had heard a sound while his sibling was asleep. He had gone up to investigate and found a small girl standing in the living room watching the television, which was showing nothing but static fuzz. When she saw him, she smiled at him, a slow, wrong smile, and then turned and ran directly into the wall and disappeared. The whole household knows the house is haunted. It is large, and they got it for a very good price. Moving is not currently an option, and so they stay. And so the nights continue, one after another, in a house that has made itself very clear about who or what else considers it home. What do you think? Which of these stories reached deepest into you tonight? Have you ever experienced something in your own home that you have never been able to fully explain to another person? Something that you know was real, no matter what anyone else has said? Please share it in the comments below. Every single story here deserves to be heard, and I read every one of them. And if you found yourself gripping your blanket a little tighter tonight, or glancing over your shoulder just once, please like this video and share it with a friend who loves a good scare. Let them feel what you felt. And before I let you go, I want to extend a very warm and genuine thank you to all of our members and patrons whose names you can see on screen right now. Your continued support of this channel means the world, and none of this would be possible without you. If you would like to join that wonderful community and support what we do here, please follow the link and find out more. One last thing, starting next week, we are diving into something a little different. Cryptid Week is coming. A full week dedicated entirely to the things that lurk beyond the edge of the map and defy every category we have tried to put them in. I hope you will join me for that. Make sure you have hit that notification bell so you do not miss a single night of it. That is everything from me for now. Take care of yourselves. Keep the light on if you need to. And until next time, stay awesome, stay curious, and stay just a little bit wonderfully unsettled. Good night, everyone.